I have watched a great many people stay broke in one very sophisticated way. They keep waiting to be ready. They want one more book, one more podcast, one more article, one more week, one more market dip, one more conversation with somebody who sounds smarter than they feel. And while they are doing all of that, they tell themselves a flattering story. They tell themselves they are being careful. Sometimes they are. Most of the time they are just scared, and fear has a way of borrowing the language of wisdom. I do not say that to be unkind. I say it because this habit costs people a fortune, not all at once. Quietly, year by year, opportunity by opportunity, compounding period by compounding period. The reason I care so much about a person's first real investment decision is not because $10,000 is some magical number. It's because the first meaningful pile of money forces a confrontation. Do you want certainty or do you want progress? Most people say they want progress. Then they behave as if certainty is the entry ticket. It is not. There is no point in investing where the world suddenly sits you down, places a hand on your shoulder and says, now you know enough. Now nothing can go wrong. Now your timing will be perfect. Now your emotions will behave. That day does not come. Not in markets, not in business, not in life. If you insist on feeling fully prepared before you begin, then what you are really asking for is the removal of uncertainty. And uncertainty is the price of admission. It is the ticket. It is the fee. It is what you pay in order to participate in long-term growth. That is one of the hardest lessons for beginners because most people have been trained all their lives to think that rewards come only after certainty. Study enough, and you get the answer right. Train enough, and you execute without error. Plan enough, and life unfolds cleanly. Investing does not work that way. In investing, the reward goes to the person who can act sensibly while certainty remains unavailable. That is why patience matters so much. That is why temperament matters so much. That is why systems matter so much. And that is why a person's first $10,000 can tell you far more about his future than his opinions ever will. Opinions are cheap. Behavior is expensive. I have met countless people who could explain compound interest better than they could practice it. They know the charts. They know the math. They know that starting early matters. They know that broad diversification works. They know that costs matter. They know that tax-sheltered accounts are useful. They know that panic selling is foolish. And still they do nothing. Why? Because knowledge and action are not the same thing. The world is full of people who understand the logic of wealth, but remain trapped by the emotions of wealth building. That is where the real battle is. Not in the spreadsheet, not in the app, not in the forecast. The battle is in the gap between what you know is sensible and what you can force yourself to do while uncertainty is staring you in the face. A person with $10,000 sitting in a bank account often feels two things at once: relief and hesitation. Relief because cash changes how you stand in the world. Cash makes problems feel less immediate. It softens the edge of uncertainty. It gives you room to breathe. If your car breaks down, that is unpleasant instead of catastrophic. If your employer becomes unbearable, that is frustrating instead of paralyzing. If life surprises you, you have a cushion between inconvenience and desperation. That part is real. Cash is valuable. I have never mocked liquidity. Liquidity is one of the cleanest forms of psychological stability available to ordinary people. But hesitation enters. Because once you have enough cash to stop panicking, you are suddenly faced with a harder question. How much of this money exists to protect me, and how much of it should begin building my future? That is the dividing line most people mishandle. They either invest money they cannot afford to have fluctuate, or they keep too much money idle long after it has stopped serving a protective role. Both errors come from the same place: confusion. And confusion is expensive. I have always liked clean buckets: money for emergencies, money for near-term obligations, money for long-term ownership. When those buckets get mixed together, emotions take over. When emotions take over, People make sloppy decisions and then call them cautious. A proper emergency fund belongs where it can be reached. That is not a debate. Life is too unpredictable to build your house on the assumption that nothing will go wrong. People lose jobs. Children get sick. Roofs leak. Cars fail. Markets fall when you least want them to. A sound investment life starts with the respect to admit that reality is messy. If you have only yourself to worry about, maybe a few months of expenses is enough. If others depend on you, or your income swings around, or your own temperament is anxious, you may want more. That is fine. I am not interested in theoretical perfection. I am interested in structures people can actually live with, but beyond what is reasonably necessary for protection and short-term plans. Idle cash begins charging you a hidden price. It looks safe. It feels responsible. It often earns a little interest and gives you the illusion of progress. But the problem is not whether cash is stable. The problem is what cash fails to do. It does not participate in growth. It does not own productive assets. It does not compound in the way equity ownership compounds. And it does not protect you from the gradual erosion of purchasing power the way many people assume it does. Inflation is one of the most elegant thieves ever invented. It does not scare you. It just reduces your claim on the future a little bit each year and waits for you to call that prudence. That is why so many people become excellent savers and poor wealth builders. They confuse stored effort with productive capital. They learn to admire the number in the account without asking what that number can still buy, and because the number itself looks steady, they feel secure while their future weakens quietly in the background. I do not want people to merely feel financially organized. I want them to become owners. That is the turn. That is the inflection point. The first $10,000 matters because it is usually the first moment a person can begin making the transition from storing labor to owning capital. If you do not understand that shift, the rest of investing will seem abstract. If you do understand it, the whole process becomes much clearer. Money does not become powerful simply because you keep it. Money becomes powerful when it begins owning things that produce businesses, earnings, cash flows, innovation, pricing power, human effort scaled across thousands of enterprises. That is what broad equity ownership gives you. It lets an ordinary person with no special genius participate in the productive energy of the economy. That is not glamorous, which is one reason many people overlook it. They want a trick. They want a hidden door. They want a secret. I have spent enough time in markets to tell you that the ordinary path is often the most reliable one. Reliable is underrated because it does not entertain the ego. A person wants to believe his future will be built by insight dramatic enough to make him feel exceptional. Far more often it is built by a process boring enough to be repeated for decades. That brings us back to procrastination. The beginner says, "I will invest once I feel ready." What he usually means is, "I will invest once I no longer feel fear." That is a dangerous sentence because fear does not disappear before action. It changes shape after action. And usually the best way to reduce fear is not to study indefinitely. It is to begin with a sensible system small enough that uncertainty does not knock you off balance. That is the mistake many beginners make. They think if they are going to start, they must start dramatically. They must choose perfectly. They must make a declaration. They must select the ideal account, the ideal asset mix, the ideal time, the ideal forecast, the ideal amount. This is vanity disguised as planning. The market does not need your dramatic entrance. It needs your steady participation. That is why I would much rather see a person begin simply and correctly than prepare magnificently for a future that never arrives. Start small, start correctly, then keep going. That beats waiting for brilliance. I have seen people waste 10 years preparing to be the kind of investor a disciplined person becomes by simply contributing for those same 10 years. That is the absurdity. The cautious man often ends up taking the larger risk because he sits still while time moves against him. You can see this clearly when you compare one person who invests $10,000 at 25 and another who waits until 35. The difference is not just 10 years on a calendar. It is 10 years of miscompounding, 10 years of misparticipation, 10 years of time refusing to work on your behalf because you were still trying to negotiate with uncertainty. That is not prudence. That is delay dressed up in respectable clothing. Time is the one variable beginners treat as if it can be replaced later. It cannot. You can add more money later. You can refine your account structure later. You can learn more later. You cannot buy back the early years of compounding once they are gone. That is why time in the market matters so much more than timing the market. The desire to time things perfectly is deeply human. It appeals to control. It appeals to intelligence. It appeals to the fantasy that a clever person can bypass the emotional cost everyone else must bear. Usually he cannot. Usually he simply trades one obvious form of uncertainty for a more expensive form of hesitation. And then there is the second trap. Honest people finally decide they are ready. They do not want boring ownership. They want excitement. They want the hot stock, the hot coin, the hot sector, the hot narrative. They want to feel as if waiting made them special, as if all that preparation earned them the right to skip the ordinary path and leap directly into outperformance. This is where a lot of financial pain begins. The market is full of opportunities to look smart briefly. It is far less full of opportunities to build durable wealth without emotional wreckage. A beginner learns just enough to become dangerous. He understands some vocabulary. He hears a few stories. He starts to think sophistication means concentration. He begins confusing confidence with competence. Then the first serious pile of savings becomes not the foundation of a life, but the fuel for an identity experiment. That usually ends badly. I have nothing against curiosity. If a person wants to own an individual stock with a small amount of his money as tuition, that is his business. But tuition should not become destiny. Your future should not depend on whether your excitement happens to be correct. That is not investing. That is self-expression, using markets as a stage broad. Low-cost, diversified ownership remains one of the most sensible ways for ordinary people to build wealth. The reason it works so well is almost insulting in its simplicity. You stop trying to prove that you are unusually perceptive and instead participate in the general productivity of thousands of businesses. You reduce the chance that one emotional mistake destroys years of effort. You lower costs, you lower friction, you reduce the need for constant interpretation, and you make endurance more likely. Endurance is the real engine. People admire returns. They should admire endurance, because returns belong to the person who stayed. This is another point beginners misunderstand. They think the market rewards knowledge directly. Often it rewards behavior. Can you keep buying while headlines are ugly? Can you remain invested while others panic? Can you resist turning volatility into a personal drama? Can you hold broad productive assets long enough for compounding to become visible? That is what matters. And this is why foundations come first. If you invest without a proper emergency fund, every market decline threatens not just your balance but your peace of mind. If your short-term obligations are tangled up with your long-term investments, volatility becomes frightening for the wrong reasons. If expensive debt is draining you every month, then investing may feel like one step forward and two steps back. If you ignore tax-advantaged accounts or employer matches, you are walking past structural advantages while searching for cleverness. That is backward. I always prefer structure over heroics. An employer match is close to free money. Take it, a tax-advantaged account is a clean tailwind. Use it, low-cost funds reduce drag, prefer them. Automation reduces emotional interference. Build it, these things are not dramatic. But drama is not the goal. The goal is to create a process strong enough that your emotions matter less. That is the point of systems. They are not there because people are weak. They are there because people are human. Automation is one of the best financial inventions available to ordinary people. When money moves into savings and investment accounts on schedule, you remove 1,000 little negotiations with yourself. And self-negotiation is where intentions go to die. An end of a long month, after stress, after distraction, after comparison, after temptation, your ability to make noble decisions is usually lower than you think. So build a structure that asks less heroism from you. Have contributions happen automatically. Let good behavior occur before lifestyle has time to absorb every raise. Fund retirement accounts steadily. Own broad assets quietly. Do not turn investing into a second job unless your life and skill truly call for that. The whole point is to make your money shoulder more of the long-term burden so your attention can return to living. Another great beginner mistake is believing that because investing should be boring, it should also feel easy. Boring and easy are different things. Investing should be repetitive. It should not require constant stimulation. But emotionally, it can be very hard, because the fee for long-term returns is volatility and uncertainty. That is the cost of admission. A savings account offers lower returns partly because it asks less emotional endurance from you. The stock market offers higher long-term returns because it demands that you tolerate fluctuations without being rewarded on your preferred timetable. That is the bargain, Manny. People say they want the bargain. Then a downturn comes and they behave as if the cost was unfairly introduced. After the fact, it was not, it was always there. The person who understands this in advance has a massive edge. He stops treating volatility as evidence of failure and starts treating it as the known price of admission to a productive system. That change in framing matters enormously. If you think volatility means something has gone wrong, you will be tempted to sell. If you understand volatility as the toll road to long-term growth, you are more likely to stay in the car. And staying in the car is where fortunes are built. Panic selling is almost always more structural than intellectual. A man tells himself he sold because he saw danger. Often he sold because his foundation was weak. He needed money too soon. He had no cash buffer. He owned things he never truly understood. He confused temporary decline with permanent impairment because he never built a system designed to survive discomfort. A gained structure. Everything comes back to structure. A strong system does not make you fearless. It makes your fear less important. That is enough if you have proper liquidity, if you have separated your short-term money from your long-term capital, if you are using retirement plans and tax shelter where possible, if you own broad, low-cost funds, if contributions happen automatically, then a large portion of beginner mistakes become much less likely. Not impossible, less likely. That is how wise people operate. They do not seek perfection. They reduce the probability of ruin. They reduce the need for brilliance. They build a financial life that can survive ordinary human emotions. That is much smarter than pretending those emotions do not exist. I also think many people underestimate how much identity interferes with investing. The beginner often wants not just returns, but a story. He wants to say he found the winner. He wants to feel clever before he becomes wealthy. He wants the market to confirm his intelligence. This is why index investing can feel unsatisfying to the ego. It does not let you act like a prophet. It lets you act like an owner. And ownership is enough, more than enough. There is tremendous freedom in deciding that your future does not depend on being unusually exciting. That freedom is underappreciated. You do not need to know which technology will dominate. You do not need to forecast central banks with precision. You do not need to discover a hidden gem that nobody else noticed. You need to participate in productive assets, keep costs low, avoid self-destruction, and stay the course. That sounds plain because it is plain, and yet plain has built more real wealth than bravado ever will. This is why the first $10,000 is not merely money. It is proof of capacity. If you saved it, then you have already demonstrated something hard. You have shown that behavior can be shaped. You have shown that some part of your income can be directed rather than consumed. That is the hard part. Once behavior is aligned, math becomes your ally. A person with disciplined behavior and an ordinary income can build an astonishing amount over time. A person with large income and unstable behavior can remain fragile almost indefinitely. Income helps, behavior determines what survives. So if I were speaking to someone holding his first meaningful pile of cash, I would tell him not to ask, how do I feel absolutely certain before I start? I would tell him to ask better questions. Do I have enough cash set aside, some Wall Street timing on me? Have I eliminated the kind of debt that overwhelms reasonable returns? Am I taking free employer match? If it is available, am I using tax advantage space before chasing complexity? Can I buy broad, low-cost funds and automate the process? Can I accept that the process will feel slow before it feels powerful? Can I give up the fantasy of perfect confidence and replace it with sensible participation? Those questions produce action. Those questions build lives. A lot of wealth is built not by predicting brilliantly, but by refusing to delay the sensible. That sounds almost too simple. But in finance, almost too simple is often exactly right. There is a kind of relief in realizing you do not need a dazzling strategy. You need a survivable one. You need a process you can stick with when work is exhausting, when markets are ugly, when social media is loud, when your friends are bragging about fashionable trades, and when your own mind is tempted to renegotiate with your plan. That is where wealth begins, not with confidence, with participation, not with a story, with a structure, not with perfect timing, with enough humility to begin before you feel ready and enough patience not to interrupt the process once it starts. That is the whole game. Not excitement, not prediction, not applause. Beg and protect the foundation. Use the structural advantages available to you. Own productive assets. Automate the habit. Keep costs low, let time work. And do not waste your best compounding years trying to feel a kind of certainty the market never promised you in the first place. If you can do that, your first $10,000 stops being a number. It becomes a turning point. A moment where fear stops deciding everything. A moment where the future begins to have structure instead of just hope. A moment where money starts behaving less like stored labor and more like a quiet partner building something alongside you. That is what people should want, not the thrill of feeling smart for a week. The stability of being right for decades. I would choose decades every time, because decades are where wealth becomes visible. Decades are where boring becomes beautiful. Decades are where the person who began awkwardly, imperfectly, and early outruns the person who waited elegantly for certainty. And if there is one financial truth I would want tattooed in the mind of every beginner, it is this: you do not get paid for waiting until you feel ready. You get paid for being invested while the future unfolds.